When a forest is cut down or burned, in addition to the destruction of the trees and wildlife, millions of tons of carbon are also released into the atmosphere. It joins the pollution already up there, warming the planet even more. This is one of the most dangerous regions in Colombia because it is a strategic trafficking corridor that connects the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. These indigenous communities, amid this adversity, struggles to keep on doing what they have done for centuries, protect the earth.
Una comunidad negra en su zona rural es la reina porque conoce el canto de las aves, los ritmos de la marea, la luna y la relación que hay entre la luna, la marea y los vientos con las actividades productivas para pescar, cuando es óptimo para cazar, cuando es óptimo para sembrar, cuando está el clima. Entonces hay una relación muy armónica entre comunidad negra y territorio porque dependemos del territorio.
Como indígenas que somos, el territorio es la madre de nosotros. Nosotros sin el territorio no tendríamos vida. Entonces nosotros lo que hacemos es cuidar del territorio, cuidar de todo lo que tiene la tierra. También venimos fortaleciendo el tema de la gobernanza. La gobernanza están capacitando a mujeres, a jóvenes, de que no debemos seguir talando el bosque, tenemos que conservar.
Los proyectos de conservación tienen que ver mucho para mejorar la calidad de vida de nuestras comunidades indígenas. La madre tierra ya la tenemos muy enferma. Entonces nosotros las comunidades indígenas tratamos de que así en otras partes estén talando mucho, pero en los bosques de nosotros sí bregamos a tenerlos para poder cuidar el medio ambiente.
Taking care of the forest, the water, and keeping cultural and everyday traditions alive are the goals of these communities. Their development model offers an alternative to people without them being forced to cut or burn the forest to survive. Economic alternatives such as sustainable agriculture with native species and traditional crafts are ways to help maintain healthy forests, food security, and cultural practices. The empowerment of women in the communities has also been key in this process, as they have the strength and vision of how Earth is as vital as a mother. By directly supporting these initiatives, we are not only preserving forests and taking action on the climate crisis, but it creates economic opportunities for these people to invest in their social development, because ecosystems are not only trees and plants, animals and biodiversity. They are people.
This is my home, the home of Salish, Ponderay, and Kootenai people for too many generations to count. I have grown up on this land, like my scheppe and his scheppe before that. My name is Riley, and we're going into a wildfire to see how the climate affects a burning landscape. With ever-increasing temperatures due to climate change, severe wildfires are becoming the new norm. Ron Swaney, a fire management officer, has been fighting fire here for decades. He's seen firsthand how fire behavior has changed.
Three things that cause fires to spread: fuels, weather, and topography. And the only one that's the variable is the weather. We're getting hotter, we're getting drier, and the potential is only increasing for wildfire based on just the climatology and the changes that have occurred. So it's been a dramatic change, both in the number of fires that we get and the amount of acres that we burn.
As these brave firefighters work to manage ever bigger and more frequent wildfires, it's important to remember that not all fire is bad. My Sepa tells me how the tribes use fire as a tool to care for the land. The forests were kept healthy by thousands of years of burning by our ancestors.
Respect the fire and use it in a good way. It'll help you. So with the huckleberries, the people knew this a long time ago.
Yeah.
And they burned back, so in a few years they get back to that berry patch, and the berries are bigger and cleaner. And it makes food for all the animals out there too to come in. It's kind of a natural thing, you know, for the fire burning.
He says there was a position of great honor in the tribe, that of Spram, the one who makes fire. The old ways are still relevant. What the Spram used to do, they now call prescribed burns. They are the same thing, lighting fires at a time of year when it will help the forests instead of hurting it. That makes dangerous fires less likely. It is hard for us to imagine today because for over 100 years we have been trying to keep fire off the land. The result is that the forests have grown dense and are now much more prone to fire.
Our fire seasons start earlier, they last longer. We'll go into October, close to November, with very little moisture, elevated temperatures, and still quite a bit of fire potential.
If we have the courage, compassion, and endurance of these firefighters, we can face the challenges of climate change head on. I think we have a lot to learn by looking at how our ancestors used fire. The land needs the help and knowledge that comes from thousands of years of living in this place.
Welcome, everyone. I'm back again, and it's my distinct privilege to be here at COP26 to help represent the United States on Nature Day. And it's an honor for me to be joined by my colleague, Administrator Samantha Power. Today we have the opportunity to put a spotlight on the power of nature as we face the challenge of addressing the intersection of the climate and biodiversity crises facing our globe. In all of this, there's a central role that Indigenous communities can and must play. And in fact, we have been doing it for generations. I look forward to our discussion, but I first want to say how much I enjoyed the videos we just watched. What comes through is a powerful reminder that Indigenous people have stewarded this earth since time immemorial. Traditional knowledge is an invaluable resource that will help our entire world address the climate crisis. The knowledge about the regenerative power of fire that the grandfather in that video shared with his grandson is wisdom that has been refined over thousands of years. We put a fancy name on it now, prescribed fire, but it's based on a simple concept that Indigenous people have known and practiced for many generations. Fire can be a force for good when it's respected and controlled. That video reminds me of when I was in the cornfield with my own grandfather and how he passed our traditional knowledge down to me as we tended the cornfields that our pueblo has cultivated since time immemorial. He taught me about how precious water is, about how the snow in the mountains fed the river, which then fed our fields. He taught me to take from the earth only what we need and no more. I believe that if our societies had listened to the knowledge of Indigenous communities instead of trying to assimilate them, or if they had respected Indigenous stewardship traditions instead of trying to stamp them out, that our conversation today would be very different, and communities across the globe would also be having very different experiences. The truth is, if we're going to be successful in tackling the climate crisis and addressing the biodiversity crisis, we have to empower the original stewards of the land. If we save nature, we save ourselves. I'm proud to work for a leader who understands that. That's why President Biden has launched an ambitious and inclusive conservation initiative for the United States that is grounded in respect for tribal nations as a central principle. Our America the Beautiful initiative sets a first ever national goal to conserve and restore 30% of U.S. lands by 2030. It's one of the initiative's early areas of focus, which supports tribally led priorities. This includes restoring tribal homelands and ensuring that tribes have the resources they need to pursue a conservation vision of their choosing. We have a long way to go in the United States to ensure that our actions match our words when it comes to honoring tribes and indigenous knowledge, but my presence here today is proof that we are making progress. I will not pretend that the road ahead is easy. It's messy to reckon with past injustices, and the climate and biodiversity crises we face are very complex. But I draw inspiration from the resilience I see every single day from Indigenous communities everywhere. This resilience is something that every government and every country can learn from, so that ultimately we can manage our lands, waters, and resources, not just across political boundaries or budget years, but across generations. With that, I am very happy and honored to introduce a woman who is an amazing humanitarian, a champion for underserved people across the globe, and whose voice has resonated for decades. Administrator Samantha Power, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Secretary Holland. To share this moment with you, the first Native American Cabinet Secretary in U.S. history, is such a profound honor. Now, Secretary Holland hasn't mentioned this, but I gather that every now and then, for inspiration or affirmation, she looks at a photo from 1948. The photo behind us here in black and white depicts George Gillette, chairman of a North Dakotan tribal council, standing beside U.S. Secretary of Interior Julius Krug as Krug signed the 1948 Garrison Dam Agreement, through which the tribe sold 155,000 acres of its most fertile ancestral land to the federal government so the government could build a dam. This dam, Gillette must have known, would flood his tribe's richest ancestral land. In the photo, Gillette of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation is standing above Krug, who is happily signing the agreement. Gillette is not in traditional garb. He's wearing a pinstripe suit and tie. And the picture captures him taking off his glasses and weeping into his hand. As Krug and the government assume control over 155,000 acres of this tribal land, and Gillette watches it happen, all he can do is cry. How many times has this scene played itself out around the world? How many times has this story been written and these pacts been made, more often in blood than in ink? How much more could the rest of us have done to preserve the lands that indigenous communities had toiled and nurtured and loved over countless generations? We are here at COP26 to talk about climate change, but we can't talk about climate change without talking about justice and injustice. And we can't talk about justice and injustice without transforming the way we engage with indigenous communities, without acknowledging the history that has brought us to this existential planetary crisis, without seeing all that we have to learn from people who have cared for their land in a way that the rest of us too often have not. At this COP, adaptation is finally getting the attention it deserves. And equity, too, is a topic of conversation in a way that it hasn't been in the past. But this isn't just a moral imperative. it is also 100% in our collective interest. Because the truth is we can't meet a single one of our objectives if we don't learn from those who are light years ahead of us in practicing nature-based conservation, or, as they would likely put it, in simply respecting nature. Indigenous peoples and local communities globally who rely on the environment for their livelihoods, for sustenance and healing, have been adapting for decades. Indigenous peoples own and manage about a quarter of the Earth's lands, and their territories intersect with 40% of land-based protected areas. Proof that indigenous and local populations are effective stewards of critical ecosystems is clear. On lands that indigenous peoples and local communities legally control, deforestation rates are lower and the amount of stored carbon is higher than on neighboring lands and forest areas. And a quarter of the world's above-ground carbon is stored in tropical forests on land managed by indigenous peoples. But despite this, we have not actually looked to the knowledge and understanding of indigenous peoples and local communities in the fight against climate change. Despite having indigenous populations in mind when we work with partner governments, too often we impose ideas rather than source them. We see local communities as beneficiaries of our programs instead of leaders with the capacity to develop and implement their climate-smart solutions. At USAID, we've made some strides in recent years to bring indigenous communities into the center of our environmental programming. In Peru, for example, we've worked with 7 indigenous communities in the Amazon, along with a local NGO, to form a forest alliance that helps local peoples earn a living while restoring their environment. Last year, when COVID-19 reduced law enforcement presence in the Amazon dramatically, the world witnessed a rise in illegal incursions and logging. At the same time, traditional market links were broken, making it harder for these local indigenous groups to sell goods and earn a living. So we formed a cooperative with indigenous women who use traditional methods to make artifacts and handicrafts, and we've helped them get those items to market. At the same time, we enlisted these same indigenous communities in the monitoring of land deforestation and degradation and connected them with regional and local authorities to report illegal activity. In Madagascar, we've taken similar steps, helping forest communities grow and sell spices like vanilla that thrive under thick forest cover so they can earn a living while restoring their local forests. These efforts are important, but we have to do more to make sure that climate protection happens in partnership with indigenous communities. And today, besides Secretary Haaland, I'm pleased to announce USAID's new Global Action for Climate Equity initiative. This is a commitment to work with at least 40 countries by 2030 to increase engagement, leadership, and benefits for those who are on the front lines of the climate crisis, those who've had the least to do with causing it: indigenous peoples, local communities, women, and youth. Instead of designing programs for these communities, or worse yet, around them, they will be core partners of work under USAID's new climate strategy and in fulfillment of the pledge we made earlier this week to better protect, restore, and manage 100 million hectares of land, an area twice the size of California, by 2030. We look forward to working with you, all of you, to make that happen. Thank you so much. And with that, I think we're going to start some question and answer.
I'd love for the panelists to introduce themselves. And Shannon, we can start with you and work our way up.
Yes, ma'am. Sound okay? Good morning, everyone. I'm Shannon Espinosa, and I am the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Interior for Fish and Wildlife and Parks. And in my role, I oversee the U.S. National Park Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's wonderful to be with you and an honor to be with the Administrator and the Secretary and our colleagues today.
Hello, everybody. I'm Gillian Caldwell. I'm USAID's new climate change coordinator. So I'm the person helping us to shape a whole of agency response, not the response of a single team or bureau, but of the whole agency to the most existential threat facing humanity and our planet. I'm also a Deputy Assistant Administrator overseeing a team that does a broad range of very related work in nature-based solutions, renewable energy, illegal fishing, oceans, and plastic pollution. And it's a real honor to be up here with these people today. I look forward to the conversation.
Hi, my name is Rachel Taylor. I'm the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Management and Budget at the Department of the Interior. I too am incredibly honored to be part of this distinguished panel and support the Secretary and Administrator for this important conversation. And in my role at the department, I help lead the Office of Wildland Fire. So we have a direct link to the important resiliency work that we are going to need to do at increased pace and scale in the coming years to really address the climate crisis.
Thank you all so much, and again, very honored to be here. I will ask the first question. Excuse me. I will ask the first question to Administrator Power. And Administrator, please feel free to ask Gillian to join you in an answer. Earlier this week, President Biden announced an ambitious plan to support critical ecosystems. What is USAID doing to protect critical natural areas and the communities that depend on them?
Thank you so much, Secretary, and great to begin to get to know you and your team, and so excited to work on these issues together, because I know we can learn a lot globally from what you're doing at the Department of Interior. So as mentioned, we have this kind of meta goal, which is to support partners in conserving 100 million hectares of critical ecosystems. And that would mitigate about 6 billion tons of CO2 equivalent emissions by 2030. And that, I think, has three components, and I will ask Gillian if there's anything she'd like to add. But the first is to actually conserve key ecosystems. So that's forests, which we've talked a lot about, peatlands, mangroves. So again, supporting partners, listening to partners as to how best we can channel resources to them as they seek to conserve. The second is to manage the land, working lands. And we know that agriculture and the extent to which emissions actually flow from people doing work to protect their livelihoods. So thinking about how to do agriculture differently in a more climate smart way, and supporting people in that regard. And then thirdly, I think we're spending a lot of time thinking about this today across this entire enterprise, is restoration. So basically figuring out how to restore native ecosystems that have been degraded. Gillian, I wonder if you want to add, just some of the specifics, like we have this new partnership with the chocolatier, that is an example, I think, of creative financing, but some of the specifics about how we go about this.
There's a lot of stuff to get through here. I mean, that's a great example, actually. We're working with Barry Callebaut, which is a major chocolate producer, to pay cocoa farmers to reduce emissions and conserve biodiversity and restore native forests. And this is just one of several public-private partnerships that we're looking to forge. As Samantha had said, agriculture is a primary driver of emissions, and in fact, agriculture is also a primary driver of deforestation. So emissions, may come via methane, but they may also come by, of course, cutting down the trees, not just losing the tree's absorptive capacity, but also the energy required to cut and remove all of that timber. So, we're not going to be able to do it without the right kinds of private partnerships. And I say the right kinds because I think there's a lot of complexity to what some will interpret as the sort of the commercialization of nature, right? How do we ensure that when we're helping communities survive and thrive, through, for example, programs like offsets, which are sold to offset carbon dioxide, we're not enabling ongoing carbon pollution, that we're seeing this as a very last resort. I think we recognize so clearly that we need to create the incentives and the opportunities for communities to continue to survive and thrive on these lands, but at the same time, we don't want to do so in ways that drive ongoing destruction and business as usual. So, these are the kinds of tensions that we're navigating. Similarly, Samantha talked about agriculture. We have an imperative to feed the future. It's a part of a U.S. government-wide initiative to make sure people have enough food to eat. And in that context, we can't work at cross purposes with our overarching agenda to reduce carbon emissions. So, I think balancing those needs between people and planet is delicate and complex. And as has already been said, Indigenous communities really have a lot of magic in that context.
Great. Secretary Holland, I mentioned, I think, the synergies that we hope to be able to create between what you're doing at the Department of Interior, where we can learn, and what we're trying to do globally. We also have the head of NOAA here with us. We're working a lot with our domestic agencies to think about how they take the technical skills they have and bring them globally. So we'd love to hear about what the Department of the Interior is doing and will do to partner with U.S. tribes on Indigenous-led conservation, and why you see this as really important.
Thank you very much, Samantha. And what I will say, first of all, is, as I mentioned in my remarks and as we saw in the videos, Indigenous folks have been stewarding this land for millennia, for thousands and thousands of years. They have handed down knowledge that is increasingly important to us in this era. The United States has a government-to-government relationship with tribes. That is an obligation that we have. And so we're mandated by treaty, by acts of Congress, by executive orders to ensure that we are managing that relationship with tribes. And the last thing I'll say is, under the leadership of President Biden, tribal consultation and support of tribal governments and support of that relationship has been extremely important. It's a priority to the president, and one that we're more than happy to move forward. And it's an all-of-government approach for the United States. Every single agency, every single department is essentially mandated to make that a priority. I'm going to hand it to Rachel and see if she has anything to add before we move on.
I think that that set the level really well, and there are so many examples where we're grateful at the department to get to work with tribal communities and partners on so many aspects of resource management and work every day to incorporate the traditional knowledge that you're talking about in terms of managing the whole of the country and the earth. So we have multiple priorities across regions, and I think we're doing some really important work. Shannon's team in the Arctic with the Fish and Wildlife Service to implement nature-based solutions, and that includes a partnership with the Inuit Circumpolar Council to implement a coastal monitoring program that's tribally led and collaborative, which is really important. I mean, we all know that the Arctic region is facing just extreme challenges with respect to climate change and the impacts with this. And so I think our department is charged and honored to help lead that conversation and bring together the leaders of the communities up there with some of our best scientists and experts to be able to look at better informed decisions to take us through some of these challenging policy issues. So it's a really humbling time for the department, but it's also a really exciting time to think through some of the opportunities we're going to have.
Shannon, do you have one more thing to add?
Yes, I do. Another example. Thank you, Rachel. Excuse me. I think another great example, in 1908, President Theodore Roosevelt set aside the National Bison Range. And while this has become, since then, a very important conservation area, it's really important to recognize that that National Bison Range reduced the Salish and Kootenai people's land by thousands and thousands of acres. And so just this summer, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service returned the entire National Bison Range to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And that's 7,600 hectares. And, you know, it speaks to, we talk a lot about traditional ecological knowledge, but it's really deeper than that. I mean, I'm learning from Secretary Holland, I'm learning from my good friend Brian Newland, who's the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs, that it's really an Indigenous way of knowing. It's a deeper insight that we as government really have to try to grasp in some way. And so internal to particularly to the Fish and Wildlife Service, we really are working with our leadership team across the agency to try to grasp that insight so that we can feel administratively and bureaucratically comfortable with the Indigenous ways of knowing and with traditional ecological knowledge and trust it because it is proven. It is absolutely proven over millennia. And so we're very excited. The last example I'll say is Papahanaumokuakea, which is the national monument, largest protected contiguous area in the United States, is also cooperatively managed with an intent to secure ecological integrity, but also to secure Northwestern Native Hawaiian cultural and culture and heritage. And so we have a number of examples where we're doing this work.
Thank you. Thank you, Administrator Power. Your question. Oh, it's my question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. You can go in any
I'm
particular
sorry,
order.
it's my question. And where am I? Here we go. What are the biggest challenges you face globally in making these commitments a reality?
Well, we would be doing a disservice if we talked about this as if there were no barriers, right? So I think it's an important question for us both. I'd start by just talking about resources, and fundamentally, whether it's in the area of mitigation or adaptation, but especially in the area of adaptation, so adapting to the really harmful effects of the warming planet that these communities are already confronting. The private sector has just not really yet been sufficiently drawn into this domain. And so that's why I think these examples where we can draw a chocolatier into the enterprise of paying cocoa farmers to practice their craft differently, right? That is really, really important. The Prepare initiative, which President Biden announced at the outset of the summit, you know, where we aim to get to $3 billion a year as a government to be supporting adaptation work. It's really, really important. It's really important that Congress throw its weight, the U.S. Congress throw its weight behind that, because again, there are people feeling the effects of climate change, losing livelihoods, losing more than livelihoods, losing lives in some cases, and we need to show up with resources in support of their vision as to how they adapt. So that's, I think, the answer to any challenge question within this expo on any topic usually starts with resources. But there's a separate issue here, I think, that's very specific to Indigenous communities, which is relates to human rights and land rights, property rights, just in general, a lack of empowerment in governance, which means that under most legal systems, you see the sort of private industry and the extractive industry with significant advantages over communities who, again, are really struggling here to protect the land and who have so much to offer. So one of the things that is wonderful about USAID is that on the one hand, we're seeking to support communities in adapting and to resource that and to draw the private sector into this conversation. But in parallel, we are advocating with governments to expand the rights that Indigenous people have, whether that's land tenure rights or property rights, because to think that this can just be done, out of the goodness of people's hearts, that tends to be not how human history proceeds. There's inevitably an adversarial dimension to this. And it's really important that Indigenous communities have the ability to advocate on their own behalf, that their rights are recognized, and that the laws evolve in a far more progressive and inclusive direction. And so we have to push on that front at the same time we push for programmatic support and resources. Anything you want to add, Gillian?
I mean, the only other thing I'd add is that, we're still facing a lot of opposition in some quarters, certainly from industry and beyond, when it comes to the renewable energy transition. I mean, the writing is on the wall. We are going to start to get price signals. Renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuel energy in most instances at this stage around the world. And yet, there's a heavy push from existing fossil fuel industries to sustain gas and coal production, and we just can't afford it. We need to keep the remaining fossil fuels in the ground. So that's tough, but the facts are speaking for themselves, notwithstanding the help that fossil fuels have had along the way.
For you and your team, Secretary Haaland, if I may, how is conserving 30% of America's lands and waters, which I gather is your goal, the President's goal, how is that going to help address biodiversity, conservation, and climate change?
Right. Thank you for the question. And the America the Beautiful initiative, it's one of my favorite things that I'm working on, that all of us are working on as a team right now. 30% of our land and oceans by 2030. I often think about, in my work, I think about the Dust Bowl. I feel like that was one of the early ecological disasters in our country, and it was because folks who didn't have Indigenous knowledge came to the Great Plains and decided it was better to plow up the grass and plant wheat and kill off all the buffalo. There was a two-part goal for that. One of them was to kill off the food sources so that all the Indians would die and they would have all the land so they could start their farms and ranches and so forth. In the process, it wreaked ecological havoc on in almost the entire country. And when you think about the opportunity that that we have to restore some of that, right? And it wasn't just the buffalo that were decimated in that. A lot of other animals and plants were also decimated. When we think about biodiversity, there's a crisis in this country because there isn't enough habitat to sustain all that diversity of wildlife. And so working our hardest to conserve that land, to make sure that we can give that habitat, the animals and plants, the habitat they need, not only to just survive, but to thrive. We have a lot of successes in this country with the scientists working really hard to make that happen. We believe very strongly that the America the Beautiful initiative will just, give us the space we need. There's a lot of adaptation that needs to happen with this climate crisis, and I will hand it off to Shannon to add to that, and then Shannon, you can hand it off to Rachel.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. So it's been said a number of times, we're facing these intersecting crises of biodiversity, the loss of nature, and climate change. The America the Beautiful vision really sets the first national goal in the United States for conservation. It gives us something to shoot for. And it also lays out a vision of how we should do this work. In the U.S., we have such an incredibly diverse landscapes, from Arctic coastal plains to pine flatwoods to desert to other coastal ecosystems. There's really no one size fits all approach to conservation. And so what the America the Beautiful vision does is it lays out a way of working that is locally led, that is tribally led, that is partnership oriented, and that is flexible to, depending on whether we're working in Montana, Wyoming, or we're working in North Carolina or South Carolina. We could be using entirely different approaches in different parts of the country. And the great news is that we're getting really pretty good at this. I mean, we've been doing this for a very long time, whether it's stream restoration in the Blackfoot Valley in Montana, or it's water quality protection in the Chesapeake Bay, or it's peat restoration and ecosystem soil restoration in the Everglades. We have been building the capacity to do conservation at this scale and in this collaborative way for 30 years. And what the president has done is he has set us a very ambitious goal to employ these techniques and tactics and know-how and all start rowing toward the same goal line, to mix my metaphors. Anything to add, Rachel?
I was gonna amplify the same point. I think the idea of the locally led conservation is just so exciting and speaks to the point Shannon made about, there's not a one size fits all solution for the work that we're going to have to do on the landscape. And one of the best things about America the Beautiful is it gives us room to honor all kinds of landscapes and all kinds of land uses in terms of our partnerships with tribes, in terms of our partnerships with working landscapes and farmers and ranchers and other local communities. And so we're really excited to to get to work on putting this ambitious vision forward. And I think that the framework that the president and the secretary have laid out are going to give us enormous tools to accomplish those goals by able to work with our local partners in a more effective fashion.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Shannon. Administrator Power, what is USAID's role in supporting systems level actions as well as ensuring inclusiveness and locally led development?
Funny you should ask. Well, I think first of all, just to pause on the question, right? Systems based, the notion that one can play whack-a-mole here, or just deal with symptoms and not causes, right? It goes without saying, I hope at this stage that we can't do that. So first, maybe I'll just talk a little bit about USAID, where I think one of the reasons I feel so lucky to run this agency at this time is that, our entire agency is a climate agency now. I think President Biden has said that about every agency in the U.S. government. We're all climate agencies. And so Gillian spoke to this at the beginning where, yes, she's climate coordinator, but her job, my job, is to ensure that attention to conservation, attention to mitigating mitigating emissions, but also mitigating the effects of climate change, that permeates across our programming. So the fact that we have, really ambitious, long-standing food security programs means that in those food security programs, we are innovating and trying to bring drought resistance and heat resistant seeds to bear in agricultural programs. At the same time, in those agricultural programs, we need to be working with farmers to ensure that they know how to bring down emissions as they till their land and not be contributing to the climate problem. So too, we do a lot of work on displacement and in conflict mitigation and conflict resolution and the aftermath of conflicts. Well, conflict and climate are inextricably linked. And the exclusion of Indigenous and local voices and women's voices from conflict negotiations has been incredibly harmful in helping stem conflict in the first place. So my point is simply, these are just a few examples of the kinds of programs and policies that live under USAID, and they have to all be brought together with attention to climate change and its effects again, in the DNA of the agency across the board. The second agency-specific response I'd offer to the question relates to something that would, I think, shock many of you who aren't tracking, foreign assistance or development assistance every day in the way that we are, which is somewhat crazily, only 5.6% of USAID's assistance goes to local organizations and local partners. I mean, that is a very small percentage. And I'm not going to go on at length about this. I gave a big priority speech yesterday at Georgetown where this was at the core of it, because we can't say we're practicing sustainable development if we are, funding 94% of what we're funding is international organizations, who when the contract dries up, may move on and go do something else of what is left in those communities. So we are making a dedicated effort across the board, but on an issue like this, it's just unthinkable to imagine that we'll be able to make the kind of dent that we need to in these challenges without really shifting the emphasis. And I say this with humility because I have wonderful predecessors as administrators of USAID who have tried to make a dent in this and shift the balance, and it's just proven really hard because local organizations have trouble meeting all the contractual and fiduciary obligations and burdens that USAID and the rules and regulations under which we operate impose upon them. So that has made it really, really hard. The last thing I'd say is just, because I think the question is really about other countries and their systems and less about USAID, which is more parochial, but this is, again, what we do. We engage on regulatory reforms. We engage on domestic resource mobilization and tax codes and how, our partners and other countries and communities can be mobilizing resources or thinking differently about their policies. So it's not just programmatic support and funding support. It's that kind of technical engagement that I think is really important. So we engage on the NDCs, on the nationally determined contributions, and with Secretary Kerry and others try to get them to increase the ambition or accelerate the timetables around mitigation, but so too helping governments set up, for example, domestic carbon markets. We've done that in Colombia, and that has raised $200 million for carbon offsets projects, including renewable energy, forest conservation and restoration, and transportation. So work with the country where they're building a system where they then can incentivize and disincentivize the kinds of practices that we're talking about. And through that program I mentioned, Colombia, 19 Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities have mobilized $24 million from the act of protecting forests. So changing the cost benefit by getting into system design with the countries in which we're privileged to work and the communities with whom we're privileged to work is really, really important. Let me turn it back to you, if I could, Secretary Haaland, which is to ask you to tease out further, if you don't mind, you and your team, the kinds of efforts that you are taking to protect critical habitat and migratory corridors, given the dramatic changes in migratory patterns brought about by climate change. Really curious about what you all are doing in that regard and what we can learn from you.
Absolutely, and I'm gonna, Shannon's the best person to take this question and run with it. What I will say is that we have a tremendous team at the Department of the Interior, career staff and scientists who study the wildlife, who study these patterns, and learn and act on the science, and that is absolutely important in this day and age. When I first got to the Department of the Interior, I just said, unleash science. We have to make sure that we are following this precisely, that we're being transparent about the work that we are doing. And so, Shannon, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Let me hold this microphone. So I think from where I sit, the thing that's most important for us is to use every tool that we have in the toolbox. And a lot of times when we talk about habitat or we talk about species, in the United States, folks automatically think about things like the Endangered Species Act. And that is an incredibly important tool. And that's a tool that's administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it includes, it's been an incredibly important tool to protect species from extinction and to protect the habitats that are critical to the survival of species and the prevention of extinction. We have to move beyond the Endangered Species Act, because right now the Endangered Species Act protects more than 2,000 species, but frankly in the United States alone there are more than 12,000 species that require conservation support. I don't care where you are on the political spectrum, 12,000 species that requiring conservation support is too many species requiring conservation support. And so we've got to move beyond focusing just or solely or primarily on those species that are on the brink. We have to protect those species that are on the brink, but we need species farther from the brink. We need them numerous. We need them abundant. That's what we want. And that's going to be the key to the survival of biodiversity. So wildlife corridors, for example, is one of the tools in the toolbox. And it's a focus for the America the Beautiful plan, for example, is to create, knit together, using protected areas, using working lands, using working with foresters, working with farmers, to knit together the space for species to regain their ability to migrate. And some of these are big game species and some of them are monarch butterflies. But there are a number, some of them and many of them are birds, for example. And so it really is about, we talk about ambition, that's been a theme for COP, and rightfully so. And when it comes to protecting habitat and restoring biodiversity, ambition should be our watchword as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, this will be the last question, and then we'll move to closing remarks. So, Administrator Power, given the important role that Indigenous peoples and local communities play in achieving our climate goals, how does USAID intend to partner with them?
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to ask Gillian to tease out aspects of our Global Action for Climate Equity program, the initiative that I just announced in my remarks. But just stepping back, in recent months and years, sadly too recently, all U.S. agencies are spending way more time than they have in the past thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accommodation. This is so important. And USAID is no exception, and we have a strategy that we are implementing and setting targets around in that regard. Often that conversation has existed apart from the question of how we integrate diversity, equity, inclusion, and accommodation principles in our assistance and in our partnership with communities abroad. So I already talked about our local, so-called localization agenda to dramatically increase the extent to which we work with and through local partners, in addition to the relationships we have with important international NGOs and so forth. That's critical. But every mission, USAID mission, is going to need to have somebody whose focus is on traditionally underrepresented and marginalized communities, and ensuring that we are not just paying lip service to these principles, or indeed not just making big and important structural changes at home, at headquarters, or even in the composition and the diversity of our mission staff, but that our programming is reflective of this. So this is going to have, I hope, over time, a big effect on the extent to which we work with and hear from and co-design with Indigenous partners. But Gillian, why don't I allow you to tease that out with the specifics on global action?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges that we face in being an agency with, 80 missions in 80 countries around the world and a presence in 100 is that it's really not possible to generalize about what we're doing. I mean, we've set a goal for ourselves to achieve structural changes that are meaningful with respect to Indigenous people and local communities in 40 countries around the world. And what that looks like on a country-by-country basis is really going to vary. And that's, I think, one of the challenges and one of the exciting dimensions of this strategy is that we're trying to set out a range of very bold targets. 6 billion, tons of carbon emissions reduced, 100 million hectares saved and restored. But there's so many component parts that make that up. I mean, just by way of one example, you know, in Peru, there's tremendous opportunities to increase the security and livelihood of indigenous peoples. And we have a policy called PROIP, which is specific to the protection of indigenous peoples and is specifically designed to ensure we're able to make those much bigger investments in indigenous communities rather than the paltry small-scale grants that indigenous communities typically get. So, you know, I think we're, you know, candidly in the early stages of figuring out what it looks like specifically. And there again, we're going to need to work in close partnership with our missions who are country-based and have those decades-long relationships on the ground.
Excellent. Anything else? You good? You good? We good? Thank you. Okay. Closing remarks, everyone. Thank you so much, Administrator Power, for being here today. Gillian, Shannon, Rachel, I was honored to be a part of this panel. And thank you everyone for being here this morning and tuning in from around the globe for this important conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. We're going to keep talking about this, and I hope all of you will as well. I also hope that everyone leaves feeling challenged and inspired to think about how to meaningfully engage Indian tribes, indigenous people around the world in your work on climate change and those nature-based solutions. We need every person and every tool in the toolbox to address the twin challenges of climate and the biodiversity crisis. And when we ensure that indigenous people have a seat at the table and are part of the conversation, we all win. When we save nature, we save ourselves. Thank you all so much for being here.
It's okay. Thank you. No, just I don't have much more to add other than thanks to Secretary Holland and her team. It was great to hear, especially really the specifics of the programs that you all are doing. Assistant Secretary Esteños, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Taylor, and great to hear Gillian Caldwell, our new climate coordinator, in action. You know, I think that there is seamlessness really between the work and the agenda that the Department of Interior and our domestic agencies have in putting science first, in putting equity first, and our international agenda. And I think this is just the beginning of a conversation we can have about how to learn from one another. USAID has a long history of taking a rights-based approach to our conservation work. At the same time, we know that we have a long way to go in terms of really ensuring that the history is taken account of, that equity and a spirit of partnership and true co-design is the method by which we are actually designing our programs and our policy, as Gillian said, mission by mission. So we know, again, that engagement needs to increase and be of a fundamentally different nature than it has been up to this point. And we take inspiration from Secretary Holland and the kind of steps she's been taking on the President's direction, and very excited to work with all of you going forward. Thank you.